And one of the exciting events of the week, of the past few days, AIPAC, the pro-Israeli lobbying group, had its annual conference this week and, among other things, hosted all the presidential candidates, including Donald Trump. Now, this did not sit well with every subset of the American Jewish community, to say the least. In fact, there was a low-key but nevertheless well-publicized protest to Donald Trump's appearance there. And here to talk about this now is one of those protesters. Ethan Miller is an activist with If Not Now, which describes itself as a movement to end the American Jewish community's support for the occupation and gain freedom and dignity for all Israelis and Palestinians. Ethan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So now, did I get that right? You were in the room when the Donald spoke?
We were outside the Verizon Center in the streets. We were not actually in the Verizon Center.
Was it because you couldn't get in, or you didn't try to get it? You know, you wanted to keep the protests outside? I know there were some rabbis inside that did a silent protest by getting up and walking out, which I think, given that the audience was darkened, maybe, maybe it was genteel anyway. But so you guys were outside, and I know that got some coverage too. First of all, let me ask you, why did you go?
Well, so If Not Now, we're an emerging movement in the American Jewish community. Like you said, we're working to end specifically our community's support for the occupation and transform our community into one that is fighting for freedom and dignity for all Israelis, all Palestinians, all Americans, everyone across the world. So in that vein, when we saw that AIPAC, which is an institution that claims to speak for our community, was welcoming Donald Trump with open arms in the spirit of bringing everyone together, we knew that we had to act, because we've seen, especially in the last few weeks, the escalation of violence that his supporters are committing against people of color, against immigrants, all protesters of all sorts. And we know that as Jews, we have a duty to stand up against this kind of hatred and oppression.
You know, all of this is so interesting and heartening for me to watch. Ethan, just to give you the context for me talking about this, I'll give you 2 points of information about me. One is I did have a bar mitzvah, and two is it was in 1966. So you could do the math. I'm old. And by the way, I got to see the Beatles at Shea Stadium on my 13th birthday, so it was a great birthday and bar mitzvah. But I guess the point of telling you that is a couple things. One is, of course, the idea of protesting the Israeli government's policies was unthinkable back in those days. But on the flip side, those were the days when the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish organizations were at the forefront of fighting for civil rights for everyone. So I feel like so much has shifted in the generations since then. Did it surprise you? Let's start with this. Did it surprise you that AIPAC, which is widely considered to be the most powerful Israel-oriented and Jewish-oriented lobby in the country, did it surprise you that they invited Trump in the first place?
I think our first response was one of disgust, but then as we were processing it, it actually isn't surprising at all, because the policies of AIPAC and the rhetoric, and I guess you could call them policies with Donald Trump, are actually pretty similar, and they're playing from the same playbook of inciting fear in communities and pointing the finger at specifically one or two groups, in both their cases at Muslims both in this country and abroad, as the culprits of the issues that they're trying to address. So they're really just playing from the same playbook in this case.
Yeah, so while they may or may not differ, it probably do differ a little bit on, let's say, Latino immigrants or whatever, that Trump's anti-Muslim bigotry is likely to be music to their ears in a certain way, right?
Yeah, and actually that's what we saw at the conference. Donald Trump told them, and in fact, all the candidates really told them exactly what they wanted to hear, which is pointing the finger at everyone else, except for the Jewish community and the Israeli government for the ongoing occupation, which we know it's a daily nightmare for the folks living in it, and it's a moral crisis for the people who are administering it and supporting it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And let me ask you a personal question, Ethan Miller, if
Sure.
not now, if I may.
Yeah.
Do you ever get called a self-hating Jew at family get-togethers?
Luckily, I think my family either is with me on this or understands me enough that that's not the case. But I do know from a lot of my friends, a lot of my, the people I'm working with in this, that is something that people encounter from their families, from, rabbis in their community leaders, people that they've looked to in the past for guidance on all sorts of other issues, whether it be, really narrowly focused American civil rights issues, gay rights, issues of immigration, things that where the Jewish community is actually in front,
Right.
and is fighting for the just cause. But when it comes to the occupation and human and civil rights in Israel and Palestine, somehow it drops off.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to talk about this and talk about it openly. I think that one of and we're talking with Ethan Miller from the group If Not Now. And by the way, when we first talked to the 0 Hour team about booking you guys, I went to your website and saw we will be the generation that ends our community's support for the occupation. And I thought, sold, But it is a generational thing, I think, to a certain extent. I want your thoughts on it, but I think that, there's my father's generation. I was, I came from an interfaith marriage, but my father's generation was lived through the Holocaust and World War II. And, there's a left-wing rabbi in Los Angeles who says, the Jewish people are suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's part of the problem. So I think that generation, and maybe my generation as well, to a certain extent, was raised on the memories. I mean, look, my Hebrew school teachers had the numbers on their wrists from the concentration camps. So, I think maybe it was hard for certain generations to look past that horrible experience and realize that, the oppressed in certain conditions can become the oppressor. I don't know. What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more with you. A large part of how we're thinking about this work, and if not now, is really that we need to break through and overcome the trauma in our community, which is, I can't emphasize enough how much it really permeates all parts of our community. And we have to recognize that trauma is real. It's lived, it's experienced, and it gets passed down from, my grandparents' generation as well, through my parents' generation to my generation, and it's there, and we have to recognize it. But we also have to know that we have to take that the lessons of the Holocaust are not that we have to defend ourselves at all cost, but that we have to work together with other oppressed peoples in order to prevent any other future atrocities. We have the slogan "Never Again," but unfortunately, I think some in our community have taken "Never Again" to mean never again for the Jews,
Right.
instead of never again for all people.
Right. I think that's exactly right. We're talking with Ethan Miller of the group If Not Now. They can be found at ifnot.net. I think that's exactly right. And so you guys, I also think there's a generation. I don't know, maybe you know them better than I. I do know I've read polling data that shows that opinions about the occupation, about the bombings that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have conducted, and so on, really vary dramatically by generation. Right? If you go to under 35s, under 30s, those numbers move significantly less support for Israeli policy. Right?
Yeah, and I don't know the exact polling data, but I've definitely seen that to be true. Although something else I want to acknowledge is that, my parents' generation or other past generations, those sentiments have definitely been a part. But I think a lot of people who would want to have voiced opposition to, the occupation, to the ongoing, violence in the region, were pushed out of the community and
Right.
may no longer associate themselves with, the Jewish community and, our institutions because of that, of their opinions. But what we're saying is we want to be Jewish. We actually we call ourselves self-loving Jews.
I love that.
We want to be Jewish, but we don't want our Judaism to come at the cost of our values.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And something else, this business about what was basically considered not allowable speech in the Jewish community is a big deal. You really have to be willing to break a kind of taboo. I remember seeing there was a liberal Jewish synagogue in Southern California, and I remember their website said, "We encourage open discussion on all issues, but we will not tolerate any criticism of Israel."
Right.
And yet, as Bernie Sanders said, and in the speech he would have given to AIPAC, and I work for Bernie Sanders, so I have to, preface that. If family and friends can't tell each other where they disagree, who can, right?
Right. And I think, it's a similar thing in the synagogue I grew up in the synagogue listserv. When somebody brings up something about domestic policy, they say, oh, we don't want to get political. But if somebody brings up something about Israel, usually from not necessarily the side I'm coming from, it's treated as non-political and just a fact of our community.
Yeah.
But,
so you guys,
there actually is a large schism in our community between people who want to see freedom and dignity for everyone, Israelis and Palestinians, and those who are looking very narrowly at the issue. But I think a lot more people are making a choice and making an active choice to come to the side of freedom and dignity.
So tell us a little bit about your group before we go, and I think that's really well said. Tell us a little bit about If Not Now, how it got formed, and what your plans are.
Yeah. So If Not Now got started in the summer of 2014 during the latest bombardment of Gaza. During that summer, a lot of people were looking, saw the news, saw the utter destruction happening, and really felt like we had to do something. And so in New York, people started doing actions really rooted in Jewish tradition and Jewish ritual. And they really spread actually pretty naturally just over social media, through various media reports. There wasn't a lot of, picking up the phone and calling a friend in California and asking them to do it. It was really organic. And once the war ended, a lot of people, some people that had been involved during that summer got together, and we started a process to really figure out, what are we building as we knew we had something. We knew we had latched onto a feeling in the Jewish community. And so we went through this process of figuring out our ideas and how we would work together. And since this past fall, we're training new leaders in our community to really stand up on the side of freedom and dignity and against the occupation. And since December, we've trained, I believe it's over 180 leaders in 7 different cities across the country. And we have lots of plans to train more, and really make sure that our community isn't able to get away with the pro-Israel at any cost mentality that we've seen so far.
Well, I think that's great, and I would only conclude by saying that, one of the problems, first of all, it's a moral question, and I love that you guys keep getting back to the moral issues, but I also think just as a practical matter that when someone tells me that they love Israel and want to protect it, I would think, well, then supporting the policies now in place with this government is not the way to do it, because it's going to lead to international isolation and ultimately weakening. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's my perception.
Yeah, I have family in Israel. I know a lot of my friends have family in Israel, and we worry sort of what is going to be the end result of the ongoing escalation of violence and of tensions in the region. And we know that the only way we can't combat violence with more violence. That doesn't work.
Right.
That we need to stand. One of the songs we sang outside the Verizon Center during the AIPAC conference was "We will build this world with love." Olam Chesed Yibaneh, and that really actually sums up the way that we feel about how we can move forward in this conflict together. Um,
But absolutely. And your group, of course, named after Rabbi Hillel,
yep.
saying, if not now, when? If not us, who? So I'm glad you guys are on the case. I'm glad you guys are out there. And Ethan Miller of If Not Now, I wish you and the whole group the best of luck.
Thank you so much.